I can't give you anything but love, baby. That's the only thing I've plenty of.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we grab a key for the room on 43rd Street near 7th Avenue, New York, 1928. We return to Saroyan's first trip to New York in 1928. He first stayed at the YMCA, as we learned in Chapter 7. He explains, "In New York, I moved from one room to another, both in order to know various parts of town a little more fully than if I had only walked by, and because every room I occupied wasn't really fit for human habitation, but would do for 2 or 3 nights." He would wake up at 5 a.m., take the subway to City Hall, and walk 4 or 5 blocks to the Postal Telegraph Office in Washington Market on Warren Street. Washington Market was a fresh produce market that first opened in 1812 and ran until the 1960s. Like the Fresno Free Market, it was forced to relocate and never really recovered its full force. And while Saroyan didn't work at this market, it must have felt comforting to be near the familiar produce stalls. Instead, he was working at the Postal Telegraph Service again, as he had done in California. He was making the most of his time there, taking the subway around to explore Manhattan, Brooklyn, Coney Island, and ferries to Staten Island and Jersey for a nickel. And some of this wanderlust was an attempt to walk in the footsteps of his father in 1906. The subway system was nothing like we know it today, and was just beginning to really grow in the late 1920s and 1930s. There was widespread construction as this form of transportation gained popularity, and the population of New York was booming. It was during this time that he began to write The Subway, one of his first attempts at the novel format. It was never completed or published. He did, however, publish the play Subway Circus in 1940, which contains a series of vignettes getting into the minds of subway writers. In Candid Conversation, from William Saroyan, The Man and the Writer Remembered, he explained, "I went to New York just before I was 20 and was intrigued by the subway that I took to go to work every morning. I started at 6 in Washington Market, and the people on the subway, to me, were everything else in the world as well as people. One was a potato, one was an onion, one was a lizard, one was a snake, one was a canary, one was a hog, one was an elephant, and I wanted to write a book, an important novel called The Subway." And you can see here the food names he gave some of the characters, to illustrate just what he was saying later in the 1970s. The room on 43rd Street, very near Broadway, was an inside room with no window, and gas lamps. This was 1928. Manhattan had full access to electricity back in 1899, so gas was historical even in 1928. He stayed in this room for about a week, though it smelled like gas and indeed leaked so much one night that the landlady had to turn it off. Across the way was an electric sign that went on and off at night, advertising Joe Cook in Rain or Shine. Though he knew of Joe Cook, he never actually saw the show, which was running when he arrived in New York in August and still when he left the next January. Rain or Shine opened February 9, 1928, at the George M. Cohan Theater and ran for 356 performances. Incidentally, the artwork on this program was made by 24-year-old Al Hirschfeld, who Saroyan would befriend and work with later in the 1940s. Joe Cook also starred in the Frank Capra adaptation of Rain or Shine in 1930. He was a famous vaudeville comedian who often headlined the Palace Theater. Given his love for vaudeville, it's sort of strange that Saroyan didn't cross the street to see Rain or Shine, but it was significant enough to make it into this chapter. He did, however, pay 50 cents to stand and watch Strange Interlude on 59th Street. A big, important cast, the most important American playwright, and I kept swearing I could write better, as of course I could. This refers to Eugene O'Neill. He would have an interesting connection to O'Neill decades later when he met Carol Marcus, who was best friends with Una O'Neill, a estranged daughter of Eugene. In 1942, Una and Carol would visit Saroyan in San Francisco and then continue on to Danville between San Francisco and Sacramento to meet Eugene at his secluded house. In Short Drive, Sweet Chariot, Saroyan tells us that in 1928, Eugene O'Neill counted as a writer that he liked and may have been influenced by. Yet in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, he says he felt O'Neill was grim from the beginning, and the grimness came to greatness in The Iceman Cometh, in which O'Neill said, "Man is a liar, a crook, a spiritual criminal, a puny, whining, miserable fraud, who must nevertheless be carefully noticed and tenderly loved. Broadway hated the play." They both wrote about the human condition through the method of literary realism, and at times comparisons were made. Saroyan apparently didn't know O'Neill personally, though. He then goes out of his way to make sure he sees Congai, which wasn't supposed to run for long. He was attracted to this because it was staged by Ruben Mamoulian. Saroyan didn't know Mamoulian at the time and was a little embarrassed to talk to him in 1928, a little starstruck. But he knew an Armenian name when he saw one, and this excited him. It ran for 135 performances from November 1928 through March 1929. Mamoulian was born in 1897 in Russian Georgia and made his way to Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater to learn directing in 1915. He then went to London and was brought to New York by George Eastman in 1923 to help start the Rochester American Opera Company. In 1926, he became the director of the Theater Guild. Mamoulian was about to find success in movies in 1930s as well. In 1980, noted scholar Dikran Kumyunjin attended an Armenian film festival, and he was given a note written by Saroyan to share during a lecture. Saroyan wrote, "Very early in the Armenian world of theater and cinema, Ruben Mamoulian was a magic name, and his work confirmed what are regarded as the main features of the Armenian character: creativity, invention, freshness, newness, innovation, humor, and intelligence. His great sophistication and energy consistently produced cinema, which was art. But Ruben Mamoulian had the kind of integrity that Hollywood could not afford. From Fresno, I salute Ruben for his constant insistence on excellence and his humanity." Mamoulian died in 1987. Saroyan and Mamoulian were acquaintances and corresponded in the 1930s and a bit in later decades. These letters are held in the Library of Congress's Ruben Mamoulian Papers collection. Mamoulian was an important role model for young Saroyan to look up to. After Congai, he says he saw Ceiling Zero starring Osgood Perkins, and describes it as full of spurious excitement which so many American plays of that time thrived on. There was an explosion in the third act, for instance, that shook the whole theater and scared the shit out of everybody. That alone may have made the play a big success. This may be one of those uncommon memory failures for Saroyan. Ceiling Zero didn't actually premiere on Broadway until 1935 and closed that summer, when Saroyan was visiting New York for a second time. So he may have been confusing his New York visits here. But in Candid Conversation, a chapter in William Saroyan, The Man and the Writer Remembered, he told his interviewer, "Memory is imagination. There's a kinship, because what you see and what you remember is never literally what it is. It's what it is to you, and that is an order of imagination." Still, this shows us that though he was newly famous in 1935, Saroyan was still soaking in all types of art and culture. His own plays would adopt pieces of vaudeville and spurious excitement, like The Harpist appearing in Across the Board on Tomorrow Morning, and other acts that he would bring into his plays. His plays were sometimes considered experimental, and yet at the same time used historical theater gimmicks and fashions. Finally, he tells us he spent another $50 to stand in the back and see Lou Leslie's Blackbirds of 1928, which he liked best of all. The people were black, the girls were pretty, the men were funny, and the whole show high-spirited. To this day, I continue to sing the big song of that show. I can't give you anything but love, baby. This starred Bill Bojangles Robinson, a famous tap dancer and vaudevillian, the highest-paid African-American entertainer of the first half of the 20th century, whose legacy lives on today. Blackbirds ran for 518 performances, becoming the longest-running all-black show on Broadway. And this is the song Saroyan couldn't get out of his head for 45 years.
I can't give you anything but love, baby. That's the only thing I've plenty of, baby. Dream a while, scheme a while, we're sure to find a happiness. And I guess all those things you've always pined for. Gee, I'd like to see you looking swell, baby. Diamond bracelets Woolworth doesn't sell, baby. Till that lucky day, you know darn well, baby, I can't give you anything but love.
He spent most of his time in New York at the Palace Theater, however, which was the premier vaudeville theater. Vaudeville was his home, both back in Fresno and San Francisco. I needed variety, and it was only in vaudeville that I was sure of getting it. A typical vaudeville bill would start with a newsreel, so latecomers didn't miss a live act, then around 10 acts and played twice a day. Anything that flopped during the day was removed for the evening show. The entire shows rotated every Monday, and this was a level of dynamism that excited many in the 1920s and 30s. Saroyan loved it, and this goes back to his need to keep moving, his hyperactivity as a young man, his hunger for more life at that time. And in New York, he may have had a bit of FOMO, or fear of missing out. This chapter is about being young and relevant, with energy and curiosity to spare, and for Saroyan, having a drive to succeed and in fact outdo the famous writers of the time. Though he left New York in low spirits, his time there was important for understanding the work he needed to do to make it big. And here he explains both what interested him and what didn't, what and who influenced him in that important summer when he was 20 years old. This must have been a wild, chaotic time in his life, and the sheer amount of information in this short chapter gives us a taste of the variety and fast pace of New York at one of its pinnacles as a great city. This chapter keeps the reader breathless to follow along, as it must have felt to be in Manhattan in 1928. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on